All right, everyone, welcome back. We're diving deep today into something I think we're all pretty fascinated by.
Yeah, definitely.
Learning new languages. I mean, who hasn't wanted to just effortlessly pick up a new language, right?
Right, like you just wake up one morning and boom, fluent in Italian or something.
Exactly. And we've got some really cool research here on language acquisition, like how our brains actually do it.
Oh, yeah. Tons of material on brain science and different learning strategies. The whole 9 yards.
So are you ready to unlock your inner polyglot?
Let's do it. I'm ready to break it all down.
Okay, so first things first. When we're tackling a new language, what's actually going on in our brains?
Well, a good way to think about it, I think, is like we're building a house.
Ooh, I like that. Okay, I'm listening.
So first you gotta have that solid foundation,
Right.
right? And that's phonetics, the sounds of the language.
Right. Got to have the building blocks.
Exactly. And then you start building the frame. That's the grammar.
Mm.
Gives the whole thing structure.
Makes sense. So then what? We're putting up walls, getting the roof on.
Well, then it's all about the details, filling in the rooms, adding the furniture. That's the vocabulary, all the words themselves.
Oh, I see. So like phonetics is the foundation, grammar is the structure, and vocabulary is all the little details that make the house a home.
You got it. And what's so amazing is how different parts of our brains, they all work together, kind of like specialized contractors, to make it all happen.
That's really cool. The learning a language doesn't always feel as structured and straightforward as building a house,
Yeah.
does it? I mean, sometimes it's pretty messy.
Yeah, you're right about that. It's not like we learn perfectly in a straight line. There's definitely a lot of back and forth, trial and error.
Tons of trial and error, for sure.
But even with all that messiness, I think that house analogy is helpful. It helps us visualize how those different elements all have to come together.
I agree. It's a great way to picture it. And, speaking of that trial and error, all that stumbling we do when we learn, making mistakes is actually super important, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. Each time we make a mistake and then we fix it, we're strengthening the connections in our brains. It's like we're paving those neural pathways, making them smoother each time.
So the more mistakes, the better, right? I'm kidding. But it is cool to know that mistakes are actually helpful.
Exactly. So don't be afraid to make them.
All right, so one thing we see a lot in the research is the idea of immersion, like being surrounded by the language. Why is that so important?
Well, it all comes down to brain plasticity. Think of your brain like a dense forest. As you learn the language, you're creating new paths through all those trees.
Okay, I can picture that.
The more you're exposed to the language, the clearer those paths get, right? They become like super highways, so you can move through the language more easily.
Oh, I see. So immersion is like constantly clearing those paths, making them nice and wide for your brain to travel on.
Exactly. And there's research showing that learners who are immersed, they're surrounded by the language, they actually become fluent way faster, like sometimes even twice as fast compared to people just learning in a traditional classroom.
Wow, that's really incredible. It really shows how powerful it can be to just dive into the language. But now on the flip side, there's this idea of the critical period, this idea that there's like a deadline for learning languages. Is it really true that as adults, we're just kind of doomed to struggle?
Right. I think that's a really common misconception. Yeah, it's true that kids have an advantage because their brains are just like super sponges at that age.
Right.
But for us adults, it's definitely not a closed door. It's not like the ability just vanishes after a certain age.
That's a relief.
What's interesting is adults, we actually tend to approach language learning more strategically. We can leverage all the knowledge and skills that we've already built up over the years.
So we're like the crafty veterans figuring out the shortcuts. I like it. So if we can learn effectively as adults, what are some strategies that can help us out? I keep seeing things about memory techniques, music, mnemonics. Are those all connected somehow?
Definitely. All of those tools, they're all tapping into different ways our brains remember things, different pathways for memory and recall.
Okay.
And they can make learning more fun and engaging too. Like music, for example, can be a really powerful tool for memorizing things.
Oh, yeah, for sure. Think about how we learned the alphabet, right? With that little song.
Exactly. It's the same concept. Music helps us connect the sounds with the meanings. And then there are things like phonetics, breaking down pronunciation, or mnemonics, creating these little memory tricks to help us remember vocabulary words. One technique I think is super fascinating is the memory palace.
The memory palace. Okay, you're going to have to explain that one.
All right, so picture this. You visualize a familiar place, like your house or your childhood home, and then you imagine placing the words you're learning in specific locations within that space.
Wait, so like I'd put the word for dog on my couch and the word for cat on the bookshelf.
Exactly. And the more vivid and unusual those images are, the better you'll remember the words. It sounds kind of crazy, but it can actually be really effective.
Wow, that does sound crazy, but also kind of cool.
hmm
Might have to try that. Have you ever used the Memory Palace yourself?
I have, yeah. It takes a little practice to get the hang of it, but it can be surprisingly helpful, especially if you're someone who learns best visually.
I bet. Okay, so speaking of memory, we can't forget about active recall and the Pomodoro Technique. What do you think about those?
Those are both great techniques, too. Active recall, where you basically quiz yourself, that's super powerful for really cementing things in your memory.
Right, like forcing your brain to actually work for it.
Exactly. And then the Pomodoro technique, that's working in focused bursts with short breaks in between. It's a great way to stay focused and avoid burning out, especially if you're having a long study session.
Oh, yeah. I use Pomodoro for all kinds of things.
Yeah.
It definitely helps. Okay, so to bring all of this together, what are some of the biggest takeaways our listeners should remember when it comes to language learning? What really works?
All right. Well, first and foremost, don't underestimate the power of repetition. Don't be afraid to practice the same stuff over and over again. Use different methods like flashcards, writing exercises, anything that keeps it fresh.
Got it. Repetition is key. What else?
Active listening is huge too. Don't just passively hear the language, engage with it. Find podcasts, music, movies you enjoy in your target language, and really listen to how the language is used.
Find things you actually like. That makes sense.
Exactly. And last but not least, be consistent. Even just a little bit of practice each day will make a huge difference over time.
I think that's really great advice. And, the more I learn about all of this, the more I realize that we actually have a lot of control over how we learn, right? Like it's not just random.
Totally. We
Not
can understand our brains and use the right tools.
for sure. So for you, what's the most important thing you've learned about language learning? What really stands out?
Hmm. That's a good question. I think for me, what it all boils down to is that learning a new language is this amazing journey. And the more we understand about how our brains work, the more rewarding that journey can be.
Absolutely. So don't be afraid to experiment with different things, find what works best for you, and have fun with it. And all our listeners out there, we want to hear from you. What resonated with you the most today? Are there any strategies you're excited to try out, or maybe some challenges you're facing in your language learning journey? Tell us all about it in the comments below. And don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel for more deep dives into all sorts of fascinating topics. We'd love to know what you'd like us to explore next.
Yeah, let us know.
Keep those comments coming.